Good evening. My name is Sean Pender, and I have the great honor of being the national president for the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And I'm glad to welcome you tonight to our AOH history webinar, the Kensington Riots of 1844, to tell the very important story of what happened then and stuff we can still learn from today. With that, I want to turn it over to our AOH national historian, who will introduce our guests and set the stage. Dan Taylor.
Thank you very much, Sean. And as Sean says, welcome everyone to another AOH history webinar. And this year, as you all know, we're in the midst of the 250th year of American liberty, working towards July 4th, when we'll have that remarkable anniversary. And we've been highlighting as an organization this year the contributions of Irish men and women to the making and shaping of our great country. As I've said on numerous occasions, the United States as an idea had a lot of appeal to Irish men and women. If you think about it, the fundamental liberties that they had been deprived of in their own country for centuries would be enshrined here in a constitution. The things that our Declaration spoke to, in Jefferson's words, unalienable rights granted by a creator. This type of a concept had great appeal to Irish men and women who had been second-class citizens, subjects, if you will, rather than citizens in their own land. And so we've been highlighting the great contributions of Irish men and women to the making of the United States. But we have to say that along the way, while the United States and our constitutional protections and the fact that we said that governments draw their powers from the consent of the governed, all these revolutionary ideas that were so attractive to Irish men and women made the United States sort of a perfect blend for Irish immigrants, but it wasn't without trouble. There were bumps along the way. And while the Irish were ready for the United States, there were some elements in the United States that were not quite ready for the Irish. And tonight we're going to talk about a Nativist reaction to large numbers of Irish immigrants in the Philadelphia area, the infamous Kensington Riots. And we're lucky to have with us tonight two Philadelphians with deep roots to the Irish community there, Kevin Brett and Bill News, who are very well versed in the history of this event and who have been instrumental in obtaining a Pennsylvania historic roadside marker to mark the place where the riots occurred. So we have a very ambitious agenda tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin Brett to start us on the substantive part of the program.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Hello, everybody. My name's Kevin. Like Dan said, I'm here with Bill News today presenting on the Kensington Riots. So let me share my screen and we will get the show on the road. All right. Assuming we are live with the presentation. Dan, does that look good to you?
We see the screen, yes.
All right. So the Kensington Riots of 1844, or otherwise, as I like to call it, the most important story you've never heard. The more that I have dug into this story, the more I realize that, especially in Philadelphia, people are aware of it, maybe, but oftentimes not, and certainly not to the level of detail that it probably deserves. There are a lot of layers to this onion. It's a fascinating story, so I think you're going to hopefully enjoy this story as much as Bill and I have come to love it as well. One author called this the deadliest conflict over religious and ethnic issues in the nation's history. So let that sink in as an appetizer. It was most definitely the deadliest urban riot of the era, being the pre-Civil War era. Or I'm sorry, it was second deadliest. The draft riots in New York City were the deadliest. But right up there in terms of historic prominence. And for my money, and I basically believe at this point that this story belongs on the Mount Rushmore, if you will, of stories in Irish American history. This was a defining trauma of pre-famine Irish America. And so, I'll leave it to you to make judgment on that after this presentation's over, but that's sort of the context of the significance here. And Bill and I have been talking. We both strongly believe that the story needs to be told, and it needs to be told repeatedly because of its significance. So what can we expect here? We're going to do a narrative overview of the story arc in three parts. So you're going to have the pretext, basically what happened and why leading up to the events of the riots, the 3 days of riots that happened in Kensington, and then the consequential aftermath. There's a lot to unpack here. We do have a lot of slides, so I'm going to try to move quickly. And if at times I may be moving too quickly, but look, we're going to give you resources to dig into at the end. If you're really interested in this, you'll have plenty of opportunity to learn more. And then Bill is going to give you a little insight into a relative, an ancestor who was present at the riots in 1844. And then we're going to close it, filling you in on plans for the historical marker installation. We're going to have the state of Pennsylvania come in, have a ceremony, and we're actually going to have a street festival, a celebration around this marker on May 9th, 2026. So definitely stay tuned to hear about that. All right, so without further ado, let's jump in. So early Philadelphia was not always kind to the Irish. So it's well documented that come St. Patrick's Day, a lot of the who we'll just get to the point on the nativist term now. Nativists are people who basically were generally of Protestant religious persuasion who felt that they had sort of like an exclusive right to the identity of being a true American, right? So people who had these like, deep American roots, we'll call them, are pretty cavalier around, poking fun at the Irish. There's some quotes on the screen about what that would have looked like around St. Patrick's Day. It says effigies were constructed, stuffed with old clothes and straw. They were carried to Irish areas before daybreak on St. Patrick's Day and hung by their necks from trees or awning posts. So clearly antagonistic behavior. And this was like basically what the nativists would have thought of as a good time, right? And this is dating back. The first quote here is 1798, and so fast forward to 1844. That's quite a long window of time where the Irish were, um, you know, having difficulty assimilating. So Philadelphia in 1844, what are we looking at here? And just this is an AI representation. This is not a photograph, obviously. Um, I have said to people, hey, if you have photographs of the riots in 1844, please send them our way. We'll be happy to use them, but this is the best we've got for now. So just gives you a general idea. We're looking for a general idea of what the city might have looked like, what it might have been like. You're looking at a place that had no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no telephones. Running water was very uncommon. It was intensely local. Reading was hugely important. That's how information was conveyed, was through pamphlets. There was lots of pamphlets, lots of newspapers. People were reading in taverns, exchanging information. Um, this was a period in time in which the economy was shifting away from artisan craftsmanship and just beginning to shift in towards industrialization. So obviously there's huge labor implications there. And then as you bring in waves of immigrants, that's cheap labor. So long-term established artisans are on edge because of the economic headwinds. This is also a time period when law enforcement was weak. It was not centralized. There was no centralized police force. Um, Much of it was a volunteer operation. It was very reactive. So much different state of play than we have today. Here are two photos of streets of Philadelphia in the early 1840s. So this is basically essentially what you would have been looking at. One interesting point of note, the photo on the right, you can see up top, it says United States Public Ledger. Well, the Public Ledger was basically um, the paper, the newspaper of the time in Philadelphia. So like today we have the Philadelphia Inquirer. If you're in New York, you have the New York Times. The Public Ledger was the primary game in town, and they're going to be one of our important primary sources for a relatively unbiased take on the riots as we progress through the story. Okay, so this is a quick map of this actually shows it's from 1854 when the city was eventually consolidated, but it outlines the districts that were pre-existing the consolidation of the city. So pre-existing the consolidation of the city, these districts were basically like self-operating little fiefdoms, if you will. Each district had its own courts, its own militias, its own night watches. Um, so you can think about like the comical view of like a criminal like passing from one district to the other, and like the folks who are responsible for law enforcement just like stopping at the boundary line. That's the sort of culture that you had with this sort of patchwork of districts. And one district in particular had a particularly rough and tumble reputation, that district being Kensington. Kensington in 1844 had already been host ground to a series of other riots. In 1928, there was something called the Weavers' Riots. Then you had through the 1928, 1828. And then through the 1830s, you had, various labor riot outbreaks, sort of smaller scale. And then you had something called the Railroad Riots in the 1840s, where basically, the mob, for lack of a better term, or the protesters, prevented the railroad companies from laying railroad tracks right down the neighborhood. So they actually had success with these riots, like meaningful success. So there was clearly incentive to do it. These weren't like carrying banners and walking through the street. These were like violent physical affairs. And so, there are people who have expertise in these other various riots, but that kind of lays out for you sort of like the culture of the time. The photo you're looking at now is a representation of basically what you would have been looking at with Kensington in 1844. You have the nanny goat market, as it's called, in the middle, and you can see St. Michael's Church in the distance. So we'll dig into those a little bit more as we go. This quote, I think, is just great for a descriptive case study on what it would have been like. So surrounding the marketplace, being the nanny goat market, along narrow cobbled streets stood rows of brick and frame houses 3 stories high, interspersed with empty lots. In the courtyards behind the narrow row houses were shanties and factories or workshops that housed the local handloom weaving industry. Irish families lived in these crowded backyards as well as in the brick and frame houses. A check of local tax records shows that almost every name of the residents on those streets was Irish sounding. So Kensington was predominantly Irish, very much active in the weaving industry. These were often DIY operations. People had shops in their backyards. So, home and work were interspersed, very tight-knit community, and everybody basically being on top of each other. This is a representation of the nanny goat market. So it was an open-air market that ran down what today we call American Street. At the time, it was called Washington Street. Very wide commercial corridor. You can still see that today. They say it ran about 260 yards, so quite long. And this was like the social and economic hub of the neighborhood. People would gather here to exchange goods, to find work, just to socialize. So very important part of the community. Another landmark was the Hibernia Hose House. This was a firehouse, and back in the 1800s, you may have heard fire companies were like a whole different ball game. They were mostly volunteer organizations. They were kind of rooted in civic pride. They were very territorial, and they liked to fight each other. There's representations of that happening in movies like Gangs of New York, for example. And so it was, they weren't really paid, so it was just for bragging rights and swagger points, if you will. But basically, a rough and tumble group of guys who really closely identified with their neighborhood. So Hibernia Hose House in Kensington was predominantly Irish, and there were other Hibernia Hose Houses around in other locations, but this was the one in Kensington, or a representation thereof. And this is an example of a hat they would have worn. They would have marched in parades. Fire parades would have been like a form of entertainment for the community. Okay, and then our third big landmark is St. Michael's Church. St. Michael's Church was founded in 1831. This was the first Catholic church in Kensington. It was founded basically exclusively to serve the Irish community there. Again, the community was pretty much all Irish to begin with. And so in a largely Protestant region, the Philadelphia region, really the nation, but this church was very, very important, clearly, to the Irish people, sort of like the spiritual heartbeat, and really also a point of social gathering for the Irish. And then this is a quick map of what the layout would look like. You can see these cross streets, and I know that if you haven't been there, it doesn't mean much to you, but it looks very much like this today. And I think the main takeaway from looking at a map like this is to see, if you see the number 6 in the middle, that's the Nanny Goat Market. It's right across the street from number 7, which is Hibernia Hose House. So you want to keep that in mind. And then about a block away to the east is St. Michael's. So all very close to each other, very core landmarks to the community. So, we get into, all right, so what was the impetus for this? The Nativists basically were political. They had a political party that they formed. It was a third party. It was called the American Republican Party. That's a different party than the Republican Party of today, but nonetheless, organized, well organized in Philadelphia. And they basically viewed European raised Catholics and immigrants as a political threat. Reason being is, Catholics had allegiance to the Pope. They characterized the Pope as a monarch of foreign influence. Americans didn't like the king in England. They don't like monarchs. They don't want foreign influence. Do the math on that. They found ways to politicize religion. A very illuminating quote from a primary source of the period is as follows. It says, "We know the Irish population, if left to themselves and not instigated by religious emissaries or political movements, are too free and easy to bother themselves with arguments either for or against their privileges." Basically saying the Irish are, can be taken for granted. They're not going to care about anything. Like they're not worth anything. So this is just common type of thing you would see in the press during that time period. This is representative of a Nativist rally flag. You can see in the top left corner, it says 21 years. That's an allusion to their party platform as follows. So these were sort of the pillars of the party. To extend the period of naturalization, meaning they wanted people to wait 21 years to be able to have the right to vote. To elect none but natives to office. So if you were from a foreign land, you were disqualified for life from holding office. To reject foreign interference in all our political, in all our institutions, social, religious, and political. And again, foreign interference, big time, alluding to the Pope. Here's a political cartoon showing, seemingly an Irishman and a German immigrant running away with the ballot box. Again, fear of immigrant control. The Germans sort of caught strays, if you will, on those points too. But I think there was a special ire for the Irish, if you will. Even in the riots, the Nativists at times marched right past the German Catholic churches and didn't mess with them at all, and went out of their way to target the Irish churches. So, potentially there are through lines to, what happened across the ocean with England and Ireland, and did some of that come here? You could probably do a whole socioeconomic study on that, but the Irish held a special place in the prejudice of the nativists. This is an example of a newspaper from the time this is actually from Boston. But same idea. If you look in the fine print here, it talks about being opposed to papal aggression and Roman Catholicism, nunneries, and the Jesuits. The newspapers of the time were tools for activism, right? Again, these were being passed out everywhere. Newspapers were highly influential. They were responsible for organizing meetings, and so they were very intertwined with political life. And there's another quote that I think is illuminating. It says, "The state of feeling that brought disaster to the city of Philadelphia must in large measure be attributed to the obnoxious sentiments contained in a certain portion of the religious and secular press of the day." So the media, the press, big time influence on the riots. This guy, Louis Charles Levin, was arguably like perpetrator in chief, lead antagonist. He was the editor of a newspaper and spoke at many of the rallies that led to the riots. And interesting to note, when the riots concluded, he was elected to the U.S. Congress and served 3 terms. So he basically rode the riots as a victory, rode the riots, for personal gain, all the way to Congress in D.C. So that just shows how when these riots ended, it wasn't like all of a sudden people were sympathetic to the Irish. Far from it. The Nativists were kind of proud of what they did. All right, and we're getting to the events of the riots, but one last important footnote here. What you're looking at is a schoolroom of a teacher seemingly reading the Bible. Reading the Bible in the 1840s was common practice in public schools, and they would use the Protestant version of the Bible, which was the King James Version. Now, given the culture of the time, given the politics of the time, it wasn't even just a matter of reading the Bible, which Catholics objected to, but it was also a matter of there was just an influence. People would say that some of these teachers in these classrooms would kind of use it as a cudgel, use the Bible as a cudgel against the Catholic students, find ways to subtly ostracize the Catholic students. So, this is a big point of controversy, and it was sort of called into question, the Pennsylvania Constitution itself, which even at the time explicitly guaranteed religious freedom. And so there's questions around, separation of church and state. And you basically have this spirit of Protestant supremacy, for lack of a better word, that became the norm that is then clashing with the spirit of the law. And this in Pennsylvania being the land of William Penn's Holy Experiment, which of all the states was known for religious tolerance, at least in theory. And so this introduces one of our main characters, Bishop Francis Kenrick. This guy, the more I learn about him, absolutely incredible guy. But he was the leader of the church in Philadelphia at the time. He was for years challenging the notion that the Protestant Bible should be read in public schools. He was trying to find reasonable workarounds, suggesting that Catholic students should be able to use their own version and or just be excused from the exercise completely. Um, and so he has this ongoing dialogue with the school board. His letters are getting published, their responses are getting published, so on and so forth. This is one of his quotes: public education should be conducted on principles which will afford its advantages to all classes of the community without detriment to the religious convictions. And so, pretty reasonable position, if you ask me. Here's an example of a Protestant response. This is direct response to Kenrick. The excerpt at the bottom says, "We must never forget that this is a Protestant land, and the spirit of the Protestant faith pervades the very genius of its institutions, and that its rights and privileges have been steeped in Protestant blood." So that doesn't sound very much like someone who's open-minded about other religious influences. And then here is a depiction of the Pope again meddling in politics. The image on the right is very interesting because that was actually unearthed by somebody locally on American Street. There is an artist who has a art studio called the Nanny Goat Building, believe it or not. And he at a excavation site unearthed this it was I guess a ceramic jar or a lid to a ceramic jar that shows the Pope playing political chess against John Bull, who I guess is the British version of Uncle Sam. So, that came out of the ground right here near Kensington. All right, so now we're getting into the actual events, the days of the events. Friday, May 3rd, the Nativists host a political rally in Kensington, which again, they knew was predominantly Irish. They knew they didn't really have a foothold there. And this was pretty much an effort to antagonize the community, under the guise of opening up a political association in the neighborhood, which was never going to happen. And so, 300 people show up. The day ends in shouts. People are throwing rocks. The nativists are kind of shooed out of the neighborhood. The platform gets deconstructed and used for firewood. Nativists kind of leave, not sort of tail between their legs, but they also knew that this was coming. And so this is a Friday, and so they take the weekend to kind of scheme on their return. So before we get too deep into the return, this is sort of a view of what that was and how it looks today. So this is 2nd and Master Street. The location of that Mexican restaurant right there is more or less where the platform was. You can look right north up the street. You can see St. Michael's Church as it stands today. And if you go down Master Street straight ahead in that photo, you hit American Street. American Street is this photo at the top, this big wide corridor, as I was alluding to. This is where the Nanny Goat Market would have been placed, 260 yards down the street. And then the bottom left is Cadwallader Street, and that's where Hibernia Hose would have been, 1 block to the left. So just to kind of give you a sense, now we're getting back to the riots themselves. The nativists spend the weekend plastering Philadelphia with flyers and drumming up support to return to Kensington. 3,000 people show up to Kensington. So this looks like a lot of people. All primary sources say 3,000 people show up on Monday, May 6th, and they're kind of like back to their antics. They have the same deal. They're on stage. They're, hallooing about their 21-year, immigration policy and this, that, and the other. The Irish are frustrated. Again, people throwing rocks, people getting upset. And then the clouds break. Huge torrential downpour hits. So what do people do? They run to take cover. Where do they run? They run to the Nanny Goat Market, a block away on American Street. So now you have people, which again, this is sort of like Irish territory. This is where they spend their time. This is home for them. You have the nativists running roughshod through this market, jumping on top of market stalls, waving the flag. And, as you can imagine, people don't like that. So it ends in fighting. Now we're in sort of a fog of war situation, right? Like who started what, blah, blah, blah. kind of unclear. But one thing that we are reasonably certain of is the first person to be shot was an Irishman who was allegedly attempting to break up a brawl. That's the story, but that's sort of where modern scholars have landed. And so, when you connect the dots on that, that becomes a turning point at which this goes from like, jawing and ribbing each other to like someone just got shot. It was non-lethal, but nonetheless, um, now we talked about the Hibernia Hose Company, sort of the rough and tumble guys at the firehouse. They start shooting back. So now you have guys in the Hibernia Hose House, a block away from the Nanny Goat market, but straight within view, just shooting at the market, shooting at the nativists from the top windows. Nativists are being killed in this affair. And so, it's mayhem at this point in the middle of Kensington. And like the flame is now burning, so to speak. Leads us to this guy, George Schiffler. He was allegedly the first person shot. This depiction is actually in the Smithsonian due to its significance, and you can kind of see an outline in the background of what would have been the Nanny Goat Market. And so this guy became a martyr for the nativist cause, a total point of rally for the nativists. Um, and so, they latch on to this guy to basically justify their actions for the next 2 days. Because again, this was a 3-day riot and we're only on day number one. Come nightfall, interesting story. What you're looking at here is what they called the seminary, or, the nunnery, if you will. Most of the nuns had gotten out of Dodge and left town. There was one or two remaining. And this is actually even an excerpt in Kenrick's diary. It's one of the footnotes that I think a later editor added, but um, one of the nuns opened the door and basically to try to get them to the rioters outside who were causing trouble and kind of throwing rocks at the building to try to get them to stop. They hit her in the face with a rock and she just collapsed. I mean, that's how brutal this was. They would even throw a rock at the face of a nun. And so this whole time you're probably asking like, well, where's the law enforcement? What's going on? So again, there really was no formal law enforcement. There was a local sheriff who had a volunteer posse who would try to enforce day-to-day laws. But for something like this, really outlandish, you had to bring the militia in. Enter this guy, George Cadwallader, who was basically from an old money Philadelphia family, the Cadwalladers. This was sort of like part of like being a militia officer was part of his like, life trajectory to bigger and better things. So when he was called in, first of all, these guys probably had sympathies with the nativists. They were probably buddies with a lot of the nativists. It was Protestant culture, again, was kind of establishment culture. So that's one factor. And then the second factor was he kind of hid behind the legality of whether he had jurisdiction. He basically said, well, look, we have to respond to a request from the governor. I don't have a request from the governor here. And therefore, my guys could be held liable if something goes wrong. And I don't want to deal with that. So basically, he kind of held back. And that's one of the reasons why things escalated so much in Kensington. And by the time he finally did start to respond, it was way too late. So now we get to the next morning, right? So after this first day of riots, this is already big news. A lot of people have died. This was a huge outbreak. So Bishop Francis Kenrick he issues this statement on the left. He basically posts this. This gets flyered around Philadelphia, around Kensington, asking Catholics essentially to stay calm, stay away, don't get involved, have charity for people, right? And then you'll see on the right is the Protestant response or the Nativist response, which I will note the quote at the top. A member of the Protestant clergy specifically requested that this quote be included in their pamphlets. Let every man come prepared to defend himself. We call on our fellow citizens to arm. Our liberties are now to be fought for, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the rallying that's now happening the next morning, Tuesday morning, around the city, which gets us to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Tuesday. 3 to 4,000 people gather at Independence Hall for what I would characterize as like a hate rally, basically in response to the events of Kensington. There's a series of speakers. Some of them are encouraging peace. The overwhelming majority are not. The people in the crowd are certainly not. And people are using this basically as a pep rally to get amped up and ready to go back to Kensington. So at that point, this is a quote from Bishop Kenrick's diary. They proceeded then, about 4,000 men in number, to the place of the previous day's fight, threatening death to the Irish. They marched in military formation from Independence Hall, and all everything that that represents, 2 miles to Kensington. And when they got to Kensington, it was just, they had one intention. And they just went right to the Hibernia hose house, start firing away. And remember, at this point, still, the Irish have a tactical advantage in a battlefield scenario because the Irish, this is like Irish territory. So they can go in the buildings, they can kind of hide more easily. The nativists are more exposed. So what do the nativists do to turn the tide? They introduce the weapon that would change the whole dynamic. They arson, and they start burning down everything. So on this day, May 7th, this is by far sort of the bloodiest and most destructive day. Hibernia Hose House gets burned down. The Natty Goat Market gets burned down. This is a jarring image, right? This guy, John Taggart, he's a shooter in one of the streets. He gets pulled out of the streets. And they basically try to lynch him. And they're dragging him by a rope down the street until he's basically has a lifeless body. And one of the local constables gets involved and revives him and then arrests him, which, I guess is better than death. But he did survive. But yeah, like this is the sort of brutality that was happening. It was extremely jarring. And so then that gets us to nightfall. This is the aerial image of Kensington we had earlier. You can see it's pretty much gone at this point. A lot of the surrounding area has been burned, particularly around the market, particularly around Hibernia Hose House. The newspaper, the Public Ledger, talks about they think a lot of people were just trapped in the fires. They acknowledge that a lot of casualties were underreported by them. So when we cite numbers that we can historically base on primary numbers, it's reasonable to say that those numbers are undersold because of sort of the difficulty in accounting for casualties. And then, to introduce the really human element. So what happened to all these families, right? So they say up to 200 families got displaced, had to leave Kensington. And then I'm just going to let the quotes from the Public Ledger do the talking here. So, well, I'll tell you where they went. They went north about a mile or two to a place called Camax Woods. It was an undeveloped forest. For those of you who are familiar with Philadelphia, this may be a little bit wild to you, but this is where Temple University sits today. So they're basically camping out where Temple is. From the Public Ledger, right? Some had lost all they possessed in the world and were driven from their homes and deprived of all shelter. Men with their wives and often 6 or 7 children trudging fearfully through the streets with small bundles, seeking a refuge they knew not where. Mothers with infants in their arms and little ones following after them, carrying away from their houses whatever they could pick up at that instant, passing along with fearful tread, not knowing where to turn. They were without food except what chance or charity threw in their way, and destitute of clothing sufficient to protect them from the damp night air. And there was even a report about one woman having a baby in the woods, and they were there for up to a week. So this wasn't like one night. Their lives were in danger. Their houses were being burned down, were being looted, and so they had to just get out of Dodge. They had nowhere to go. They went to the forest. And this is a portrayal. This is a photo of what Camax Woods looked like in 1861. So you can just see it's just undeveloped wilderness, essentially. All right. I know we're going to keep this moving quickly. Wednesday, a little more controlled, but not really. The rioters are telling the militia, we need to look for guns. So now they have license to basically go through the Irish houses to look for guns. And in the process, they're just ripping these houses apart. They're using furniture for bonfires. Pretty lawless. There's a defense play that people in the neighborhood who identified as nativists were hanging American flags, basically to say, hey, we're with you guys, don't bother us, leave us alone. And then we get to sort of the climactic event, right? St. Michael's Church. This was like the whole time, if anything was defended in Kensington, there was like an indicia of defense around St. Michael's Church, where at least the militia would stand in front of the church. But we get to this point where let's jump to the quote, right? So this is a quote from Bishop Kenrick, and you make your own decision about how he viewed the outcome here. He says, in the afternoon, the priest Lochran, who was responsible for the church, gave over the keys of St. Michael's Church to General Fairlam with the militia, hardly knowing what he did, as the mad mob was pressing on. In a short time, the church was on fire. The military, as it appears, did not prevent the firing of the church. Sounds to me like Kenrick probably thought the militia was basically implicit in the burning of the church, implicitly involved in the burning of the church. The story goes that something down the street was being burned, so the militia kind of like went and tended to that, which left the church open for arson after 3 days. And that was like the symbolic fall of St. Michael's. And at that point, Kensington had been torched. There was really not much left. So what did they do? Well, first, before we get to what they did, really quickly, I won't go deep in this, but this is a painting from Guido Reni. He's a European artist. He has works in the Louvre. He has 20 works in the Louvre, 20 works in the Art Museum in Madrid, National Gallery in London. He had a painting of St. Michael's in St. Michael's Church, which was lost in the riots. So this is the type of thing that would have been in the Louvre today, theoretically. So this painting you're looking at is a different version of the St. Michael painting. It's not the exact version we had. The version we had is lost. But just to show you sort of like, it wasn't even just the church building. There was like cultural works of significance that were lost as well. So they leave Kensington, they leave St. Michael's. What do? They march to the next Irish Catholic church, which is St. Augustine's, which is like another mile away in Philadelphia. And at this point, you're inside the boundary of the District of Philadelphia. So the mayor's getting involved. And the mayor is on the steps trying to calm the rioters, and they start throwing rocks at the mayor. Like, can you imagine throwing rocks at the mayor? Absolutely crazy. And so then they burned down St. Augustine's. So, what was some of the fallout that happened? Basically, they implement martial law for a week in Philadelphia. The governor comes in. Bishop Kenrick suspends all masses because it's just not safe. They're estimating that 30 to 60 buildings were burned, over 20 deaths, countless injuries, 200 families displaced. Again, these are conservative estimates. And from the governor, the quote, "I cannot but regard the late disasters as the severest test to which republicanism has ever been subjected." This is the governor of Pennsylvania. So, high stakes. Fast forward quickly to July. There's a second wave. 4th of July parade, the Nativists march around the city, and you can see on this map their destinations of choice are basically spots that were significant to the riots in Kensington. And so they're basically doing a victory march to these locations in Kensington, which leads to a second outbreak in the district of Southwark from July 6th to 8th. And this outbreak has its own historical context and its own set of history where basically the militia faced off with the Nativists. The church that was under threat was saved. And so we won't go too into depth there, but that's like definitely part of the broader story. And so what happened? What was the result of all this? Well, for one thing, there became a big political push, sort of like a 10-year campaign to consolidate the city of Philadelphia, to consolidate all the districts into one city so that you could consolidate police power. And so that ended up happening in 1854. And all along the way, they're citing to the riots as a driving cause. And also, sort of along the same vein, led to the origin story of the Philadelphia Police Department for many of the same reasons. And I also just want to note that this hit global news. This was being reported in London. This was being reported clearly in New York. There were similar rallies that were scheduled for New York in the following week that were canceled because of what had happened in Philadelphia, because of what they were trying to avoid. So you can only imagine if this story were in New York, I bet you would have heard of it, but it happened in Philadelphia, so you haven't heard of it. What happened to the church? So they built the cathedral. Bishop Kenrick builds a cathedral in Philadelphia. He designs it with intentionally high windows. There's a legend that says he told a worker to throw a stone as high as he could, and we're going to build the windows above that. He also he basically identifies the riots as a psychological turning point where he stops advocating for inclusion in the public schools. And he says, you know what, we got to do our own thing. And so he starts advocating for every parish in Philadelphia to have their own free school. And I just want to note, it's interesting. So he actually moved on to become Archbishop of Baltimore, which at the time was like the top seat in the Catholic Church in the United States. And he selected St. John Newman to be his predecessor in Philadelphia. And then St. John Newman often gets credited for instituting the Catholic school system in Philadelphia. But in reality, he was basically carrying forward Kenrick's plan. And so then Kenrick, as the top bishop in the Catholic Church, gets tagged by the Pope to lead the U.S. Council of Bishops in America. And issues a decree that every school in America should have a parish. Every parish in America should have a school. And so you could basically make the case that Kenrick's experience here in Kensington informed strategy for the entirety of the Catholic Church in the United States. And then this is just a view of the church that was rebuilt, making the case that the Irish didn't run away. They doubled down, they rebuilt, they said, this is our home. There were 8 additional Irish Catholic, specifically Irish Catholic parishes that were built in Kensington thereafter, just to show that, the Irish really proliferated in this neighborhood. And it's a story of resilience. So for those of you who want to do follow-up reading, these are some recommendations. The top 2, I would say, or top 3, you have Kenneth Milano's book, The Philadelphia Nativist Riots. That's a must read. He's the local historian. He's basically the one who got me started on this pathway. The Fires of Philadelphia by Zach Schrag. He's a professor at George Mason University. Really cool how he kind of takes it into narrative form. He talks a lot more about the Southwark riots as well. And then finally, the Philadelphia Riots of 1844, which is out of print. You have to get a used copy by Michael Thelberg, but I really love that book. And then there's a number of primary sources that you can find it online in various places if you want to dig deeper. So with that, let's hand it over to Bill News quickly, and he can fill you in on some family history as it pertains to the riots.
Yep. Thanks, Kevin. And awesome job of depicting a horrific situation here in Philadelphia. And behind all these horrific situations are human beings. And it just so happens that my great-great-grandfather is the person listed there as Patrick News. And he lived in that area. And you can see he's listed as like a city directory prior to phone directories. You can see he's listed there as a weaver on China Row, which does not exist anymore because in 1854 they had to update some of the street names. The K that is in parentheses is significant because it designates that it's in Kensington. And I will say, I'll go back a little bit and just say that I've been visiting a lot of the local AOHs and Irish organizations, and it is a complete honor to continue telling this story. I'm sure Sean will reflect that as well at the end. So Patrick News is a distant relative living on in the area. And Kevin, if you want to change the page. And he also shows up in a court reporting from a cross-examination I never did find out who is actually being cross-examined here, but there's Patrick News's name showing up in a court reporting as a witness to one of the murders located at, that looks like it's Cadwalader and Jefferson Streets. Further proof that he was there. Okay, go ahead. And then sometimes I wonder if we'll end on maybe a happy note here on these 3 slides anyway. Did he have a sense of humor? So if you read through, this is literally his will, dated 1893, I believe, where he leaves his 4 sons, James, William, George, and John, who's my direct descendant, the sum of $1. And he leaves his daughter, of which he had 3, but 1 took care of him through to his death. That was Catherine, and he leaves her $400. So maybe he had a sense of humor. Maybe he was trying to get back at his kids that were always pounding him for money. I don't know the real truth there, but it's just kind of interesting and a good opportunity to put some sense of humor into the situation here, because it could not have been fun, and I can't even imagine what some of those horrific days were like for some of these folks.
All right, so final 2.
Yeah, back to Kevin.
We'll take questions. Final 2 slides here is, so we have a historical marker being installed on May 9th. It's open to the public, free open to the public. We definitely, for those of you who are accessible to Philadelphia, would love for you to join us. Schedule of events is we're having Mass at the reconstructed St. Michael's Church at noon, followed by the historical marker dedication ceremony at 1 p.m. on American Street, 1 block away, followed by what we are calling Nanny Goat Fest as a tip of the cap to the Nanny Goat Market, where we will have Irish bands, an Irish trad session, Irish dancing, local food and drink vendors all along American Street from 2 to 8 p.m. at night. So, planning a real great day. And then, to the extent that you want to help, there's really a couple ways. One is this is all self-funded, right? So if you're willing to make a donation, please do. It would be greatly appreciated. That's going to help us to continue to tell this important story. And the street festival is really a way for us to connect with the broader public, right? So donations will help fund street festival events. You can go to our website, nannygoatfest.com, and specifically nannygoatfest.com/donate, where you can make a donation, and or just peruse the website in general, where you can find out information on the events, information about the events, information about vendors, If you know businesses who would like to be vendors at this event, we're accepting vendor applications, and all of that is on the website. And obviously, feel free to email myself or Bill at any time if you have input or questions or just would like to chat about the riots, because the two of us are certainly interested. So with that, Dan, I know that was a lot. I know it was a big information dump. I appreciate everyone's patience, but pretty interesting story, if I do say so.
Well, Kevin and Bill, that was fantastic, and you've really brought to life a story that, as you say, is undertold, that people don't know as much about as they should. Just listening to you gentlemen tonight, people who understand and know the history of the AOH will probably call to mind the famous defense of Old St. Patrick's in New York by the AOH at the call of the bishop there to ensure that these types of events didn't unfold further. But I wonder if you can give us any insight then into what happened in Kensington after the riots. It had been a Catholic, an Irish neighborhood. Did the Irish people eventually make their way back to Kensington? What's the after story there?
Yeah, so I alluded to that a little bit. Not so Kensington, from even myself growing up, my family lived in Kensington. My mom was born in Kensington, my grandmother was born in Kensington. I now live in Greater Kensington, but I'd say up until even the 90s. Um, Prolific Irish community, and there still is today, a little bit smaller in number. But Kensington blew up and it was known as an Irish community for generations, multiple generations. So I'm seventh generation, dating back to my family got here just after the riot, so a little bit after, more around Civil War time period. Um, but yeah, and the fact that there were 8 other Catholic churches geared towards the Irish community in the Greater Kensington neighborhood that were built shows the need, because there were just so many Irish immigrants flooding to Kensington as a hub for the Irish. Um, and then, like I said, clearly Bill has his family lineage in Kensington too. And then even today we have, I'm a member of AOH 87 in neighboring Port Richmond, and a lot of those guys grew up in Kensington. I'd say the majority of them grew up in Kensington. And so, AOH 87 is sort of a living embodiment of that, through line of legacy. And I think a lot of those guys very likely have ancestral ties to the riots as well.
And
And
Kevin,
then
you
there's also some, I'm sorry, Dan, there's
go
also
ahead,
some
Bill.
research that indicates that a lot of these folks picked up and left and went down to Delaware County. And today, if you look at the residents of Delaware County, you will find a huge Irish population down there. And a lot of that came, and my family as well. I have more of my news family in Delaware County than I do up where I am. It's kind of interesting.
And Kevin, I was saying that we first became acquainted when you came to the AOH. You were not a member at that time, and you had this project undergoing where you were filing an application with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to have one of their historical roadside markers placed. And I have to congratulate you and Bill and everyone on your team for a successful effort to do that, because you raised awareness of the issue, not just now and with the marker being placed, but in the campaign, right? You were gathering signatures, you were telling this story that needed to be told. And I think it's a good lesson for anyone who's watching or who may watch this, who's aware of a situation like this, something that's underreported on, not covered in the history books as it should be. You saw something that needed to be done, went out and did it. And now, as you guys have mentioned, on May 9th, there's going to be this unveiling of the roadside marker. And people who have driven through Pennsylvania have seen these markers, right? They give notice that on this spot, something of historical import happened. So now that people in the future who come through there are going to see this marker, maybe they're going to stop and read and maybe for the first time learn something about this. So what a tremendous effort and what a great result. I do want to talk a little bit more though about the 9th. I know the schedule of events is going to involve mass in historic St. Michael's Church. Is that right? Can you give us the hour by hour what the itinerary is?
Yeah, sure. So 12 p.m. we have mass. The celebrant's going to be Father Chris Walsh, an archdiocesan priest here in Philadelphia with strong ties to the Irish community. So he gets it, so to speak. I think his family is Philadelphia Irish. Um, and we have a great team helping to organize that mass. I think we're going to hope to have, bagpipes on the steps of mass going in, and the whole thing, make it a real event. Um, Mass lasts about an hour, come out, and we're going to walk a block down the road. It's one block to where the marker is going to be located on American Street. Again, that's that wide commercial corridor, and the image on the screen, you can kind of get a sense for it here. So the marker will be placed on American Street, basically, essentially where the Nanny Goat Market was located, as the sort of genesis of the riots. And we're going to have a platform and a program of speakers. We're going to bring in a number of speakers. The AOH will be represented. Likely, we'll have some local politicians. I'll give a much shorter spiel than today on the history. And then we will unveil the marker. We're going to have representatives from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission come in. So lots of pomp and circumstance. Hopefully, will be a great event. Yeah, then we transition into celebration. And it's funny because we've had people ask, well, why would you celebrate riots? And it's like, well, we're celebrating the resilience of the Irish who, had this trauma and came back and, rebuilt and kind of planted their flag and proliferated here in Kensington. So, in that respect, starting at 2 p.m., we're gonna have a main stage. We have five incredible bands, a couple of them with like pretty big touring profiles. They're Irish bands. They're gonna hold down the main stage. Then on the far end of the street, we're gonna have a trad session tent where we have some expert traditional Irish musicians who are going to be leading a trad session, and that's actually BYO instruments. So if you're a musician and you want to join in, bring your instrument and join the trad session. And then down the other end of the street, we're going to be having an Irish dance showcase where we are giving regional schools the opportunity to come in and participate and show off their stuff, on an Irish dance stage, so to speak. And so mixed in, we're going to have plenty of vendors, food, drink. There's a lot of breweries in the neighborhood these days who want to participate. And so in a sense, I think this mix of vendors lining the blocks are going to be representative of the Nanny Goat Market as it was in 1844. So it's kind of a cool way to tie it all together in a modern context.
And this is
Last thing I'll say too is just I think this is sort of the way, and I alluded to this. This opens the door for the general public because people love street festivals, right? So this is a way to take this story and take the significant history and tell it in a way that meets people where they are, invite them to come have a good time, spend the day with us on American Street, and hopefully, draw more attention to a story that needs to be told.
So this is open to the public. Anybody who's interested in the historical aspect can come out for the unveiling, for the dignitaries and the speeches. And then this festival is going to go until nightfall. Is that right?
Yep, 8 p.m. is sunset on May 9th. So that's when we're going to wrap things up. But yeah, we'll be, as long as the sun's out, we're going to be having a good time. That's the plan.
And as you mentioned, the AOH is going to be represented there. So if people are watching this, maybe they have a family history in the AOH, but you're not a member. We are America's oldest Irish Catholic fraternal organization dating back to 1836. This would be a great opportunity to come out, enjoy the day, meet some of the guys from the AOH, and we'll have membership applications on hand. So if people are interested, they can join the organization. So gentlemen, what a great program tonight. What a great service you've done to everybody. I have a note here that our national immigration chair, Dan Dennehy, wants to thank you for putting this on, highlighting the experiences of these Irish immigrants to the United States. I also want to make a plug. This year, we've reinstated the AOH's history essay contest. You can go to our national website and find the application and the rules. This is for high school juniors and seniors writing an essay highlighting the contribution of an Irish man or woman to the founding of our great nation. And those entries are due by June 15th. So if you're interested, ask a Hibernian or go to our national website. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our national president, Sean Pender, for closing remarks.
Thank you. I think we had Dan wanted to say something. Dan Dennehy, I should say.
Thank you, Sean. And Dan and Kevin and Bill, wonderful presentation. Over the years, as a New York Hibernian, we've heard of instances like this. Of course, everybody knows the draft riot and the defense of the cathedral. But in upstate New York, the Know Nothings brought in Nativist riders from the south to try and interrupt the Hibernian divisions in Ulster County and in Westchester County and in Verplanck, where my current division was partially founded. And these stories are part of the local lore, but the excellent research that you've done for the rest of us that are trying to find the truth behind these things, and also in the modern world. You know, these people, they still have their grandpappy's Ku Klux Klan hoods under their beds in some cases, and we're seeing so much modern references to some of these jingoistic statements in people that are in public figures today. So it's important that people remember that it wasn't easy. It was never easy. And like Sean always says, we're not looking for anything more than anybody else, but we're certainly not looking for anything less. So well done, man.
Thank you, Dan, for those comments. And to Kevin and Bill, thank you very much for all the work that you've done on Dan Taylor putting it on, and Chris Cook, you know, in this 250th year of our great country. You know, it's great to hear the good stories, and this one is a little bit darker, but I think it's very, very important to tell the truth, and that's what this was all about, to tell the truth. And like Dan had mentioned, and both Dans, and talked about, the Irish were used to this. We stood up in 1836, and that's where we were founded. And regrettably, it was in our DNA. During the time of the penal laws, when we were told we couldn't practice our faith, we said, no, we will, and we will protect our church. So, you know, the Catholic, our identity is just as important as our Irish heritage. And, you know, it's said that if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think it's important to realize what happened here was based on prejudice, hate, discrimination, based on people who looked different, who sounded different, who worshiped a different God. But that was us. That was us. And although we went into the hiding for a short period of time, we came back, and I think it's very inspiring that they rebuilt that church. But one thing about the Irish, and it's consistent even in the north of Ireland, where you see the Catholics for so many years were discriminated the same way and beaten and killed too many times. We want to make sure it never happens to anybody else. It shouldn't happen to anybody else. And today we need to take the lead from our Catholic Church, who tells us that people have a right to seek refuge, and immigrants should be treated with dignity, mercy, justice, and respect. So take for that for what it is. And what Dan had said there, we need to learn from history. We need to make sure that people are treated with respect. We are immigrants. Our whole organization is based on immigrants. And I would dare say that as we come up to July 4th, the Irish should be very, very proud of what we brought to this country, just as so many other nationalities and faiths have done as well. So I think this is something that we can learn from. And I, again, once commend the great work that Kevin and Bill have done to putting this together. And I would strongly recommend everyone in the Philadelphia area, if you can make it out that day, it'll be a great way and a great testament. And I know in seeing Bill earlier this week that I know they've been in many of the divisions in the Philly area and the Pennsylvania area. So we hope to see many people out there. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you very much. Good night and God bless.